My parents ignored my kids. Grandpa made sure they regretted it. Hey everyone, before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe because this is where the story begins, and trust me, you're going to want to see how it unfolds. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion. Today's story is one of betrayal, neglect, and the quiet, burning power of a grandparent who refused to let injustice go unanswered. From the very beginning, my life had been a tapestry of love woven by those who truly cared, but threads of neglect always lingered in the corners, waiting to unravel the ordinary fabric of our family. I had grown up understanding that love could be abundant, but also painfully selective. My parents, though financially successful and outwardly respectable, carried a type of indifference that made their love conditional and transactional. They had expectations for me that felt like chains, and when I became a mother, their eyes, instead of sparkling with pride, dimmed with impatience and judgment. I remember the first time my daughter, little Lila, and my son, Jaden, had truly shined in front of them. It was a modest school recital. Nothing extravagant, just a stage, some lights, and the innocent joy of children expressing themselves. My parents had been invited, though I had a sinking feeling they might decline. True to form, they arrived late, dressed in their perfectly curated aloofness, and left within minutes after barely glancing at the performance. I had tried to convince myself it wasn't hurtful, but the crushing weight of their absence, the coldness in their brief words, was undeniable. My children noticed it too. I could see it in their faces, in the tiny furrowed brows and hesitant smiles, their hearts reaching out for approval that never came. At first I blamed myself. Maybe I had expected too much. Maybe their love was just different, abstract, or unattainable. I thought, perhaps if I worked harder, if I became more successful in their eyes, they would finally acknowledge my children. But no amount of effort, gifts, or polite invitations could pierce their indifference. Birthdays, holidays, school milestones, events that should have been punctuated by family warmth were instead hollow rituals. Their absence screamed louder than any words they could have offered. It was in the quiet evenings, long after my children had gone to bed, that the anger and hurt would settle into my chest like a heavy stone. I remembered my own father, Grandpa Edward, who had always been different. A man of immense presence, calm but unyielding, who had adored my siblings and me with a fierce loyalty. He had a way of seeing the world in black and white when it came to family. Protect, nurture, and stand unwaveringly for those you love. And though my parents had cast a long shadow over my own self-worth, Grandpa Edward's love was a constant flame. He had been watching, always silently, as my children were sidelined by those who should have cherished them most. Grandpa's home was a sanctuary, filled with warmth, laughter, and the kind of gentle guidance that could turn any sad moment into a lesson in resilience. Whenever my children visited, he would open the door with that familiar smile, kneel to meet them eye to eye, and suddenly the world felt right. He never questioned their worth, never minimized their accomplishments, and never left without giving them the affirmation my parents seemed incapable of providing. Lila's eyes would light up when he applauded her drawings, and Jaden would beam when he listened to his endless stories, nodding as though the smallest detail mattered immensely. But Grandpa was not just loving, he was cunning. He understood the psychology of neglect, the slow burn of resentment it could create if left unchecked. And while I saw only his tenderness, I began to realize that behind those soft eyes and warm hands was a mind orchestrating a reckoning that would eventually leave my parents regretting every dismissive glance, every absent hug. He did not believe in immediate justice, but he believed in consequences, inevitable, undeniable, and delivered with precision. The tension in our family grew in subtle ways. Invitations to my children's birthdays would arrive at the last moment, barely signed, or come with half-hearted apologies. School events, sports games, and recitals continued to be ignored. I had tried to speak with my parents once, twice, maybe 3 times in a voice that wavered between hope and accusation. Each time they brushed it off, claiming busyness, stress, or some vague responsibility elsewhere. The word regret had not yet crossed my mind, but the seeds were quietly taking root. One afternoon, Grandpa called me while I was at work, his voice calm but weighted with gravity. He did not scold or lecture. He merely asked for details about the latest school project, the upcoming science fair, and Lila's painting competition. As I spoke, I realized that he had been meticulously cataloging every slight, every omission, every moment my parents had turned away. It was like he was building a ledger of accountability that would one day tip the scales. That ledger began to manifest in small, almost imperceptible ways. Grandpa started arranging opportunities for my children that my parents could not ignore or dismiss. Special art workshops, summer camps, and even social events where influential families attended became their stage. Lila began winning awards not just for her talent, but for her determination, her intelligence, and her charisma, qualities that had been consistently overlooked by her grandparents. Jaden, too, started excelling in sports and academics, fueled by Grandpa's unwavering attention and encouragement. And with each achievement, the absence of recognition from my parents became more glaring, more shameful. The house where my children played and laughed, once just a home, had become a quiet battleground. Grandpa Edward's love was a weapon, precise and unrelenting. My children's accomplishments, once minor victories in the background of neglect, were now undeniable testaments to their worth. He had created a situation where the world itself could not ignore them, where their brilliance forced attention, and slowly the whispers of regret began to circulate. My parents, once blind to my children's existence, were beginning to sense the consequences of their actions, though they did not yet understand the depth of the storm that Grandpa was quietly orchestrating. And so life continued, layered with quiet victories and subtle manipulations. My children grew stronger, more confident, their laughter louder, their accomplishments brighter, each one a testament to the love they had truly earned. The neglect of my parents had created an opening, and Grandpa Edward was determined to ensure that what they had ignored would not remain unnoticed, that their silence would eventually be answered with undeniable truth. As the months passed, I began to see a shift, not sudden, not dramatic, but creeping, inevitable. Invitations that had once been ignored now elicited uneasy curiosity. Compliments that had been withheld were replaced with awkward acknowledgement. It was as if my parents were finally realizing that their absence had consequences, that the children they dismissed were growing into undeniable power and presence, each milestone a mirror reflecting their own neglect. And though the story had just begun, I could feel it in my bones. The reckoning was coming. Grandpa Edward had not simply nurtured my children. He had armed them with validation, pride, and unstoppable confidence. The stage was set for the moment when my parents would finally see what they had lost, and the seeds of regret would blossom into something they could never erase. The story of their neglect and Grandpa's careful orchestration of justice was only beginning, and what followed would shock even those who had believed in quiet patience. The next chapter would reveal how this quiet, methodical plan unfolded, how small victories grew into undeniable truths, and how the power of love, when wielded wisely, could rewrite the very dynamics of a family that once seemed untouchable. The days that followed felt like the calm before a storm, but in reality the storm had already begun, quiet, meticulous, and impossible to ignore. Grandpa Edward had perfected the art of subtle revenge, the kind that didn't scream but whispered, nudged, and slowly unraveled the arrogance of those who had thought they could ignore family without consequence. My parents still went about their lives as if nothing had changed, yet every step they took was shadowed by the rising presence of my children, each achievement like a silent reminder of what they had failed to nurture. It started with small, almost embarrassing coincidences. Invitations for school awards arrived at their doorstep, postmarked in such a way that no excuses could justify their absence. Lila's paintings were featured in exhibitions that drew attention from local media, and photos of her proud smile, brush in hand, began circulating in social circles my parents could not avoid. Jaden's victories on the soccer field, captured by neighborhood cameras and celebrated in newsletters, created a visibility that made their absence painfully noticeable. Grandpa had orchestrated it with precision. My parents' social circle, their colleagues, even distant relatives were quietly made aware of the children's successes, and the contrast to their own neglect became increasingly stark. The subtle humiliation was compounded by the way my children carried themselves. Lila had grown into a confident, radiant young girl, her laughter no longer tentative but bold and magnetic. Jaden, with his steady determination, had developed a presence that demanded recognition. Grandpa had instilled in them a sense of self-worth so profound that the void left by my parents' indifference no longer held sway. When my parents finally glanced at them, they saw not the children they had ignored, but young individuals who radiated accomplishment and joy, their success unshakable by absence or criticism. At family gatherings, the shift was undeniable. My parents would arrive late, their faces betraying a faint panic masked as casual detachment. My children, guided by Grandpa's quiet wisdom, were no longer the shy, uncertain kids they once were. Lila would stand tall, sharing her stories and showing her art with pride, while Jaden engaged with cousins and relatives with ease and charm. My parents' discomfort grew with every glance, every smile exchanged, every small compliment they had failed to give now being offered freely by others. The subtle sting of exclusion, once invisible, became almost tangible. Grandpa's influence extended beyond mere achievements. He had cultivated a sense of moral authority in my children, teaching them that true power lay not in confrontation, but in the undeniable strength of character. Lila had learned to respond to slight or insult not with anger, but with confidence and grace, a reflection of the lessons Grandpa had instilled. Jaden, similarly, had learned the art of persistence, of turning every ignored effort into a demonstration of skill and resolve. Together they became a force that my parents could not diminish, and each interaction became a calculated reminder of their neglect. The financial support that had once been a point of leverage for my parents was rendered meaningless. Grandpa Edward had quietly ensured that my children had access to opportunities, resources, and experiences that my parents could no longer control. Summer camps, specialized tutors, art supplies, sports equipment, everything was in place to ensure that my children's growth was unhindered. It was not revenge born of malice, but justice orchestrated through love. My parents' attempts to reassert control were futile, and with each failed attempt, the simmering tension grew more pronounced. One evening I noticed the subtle shift in my parents' demeanor. They had been invited to a school science fair where Jaden's project had won first place, but instead of arriving casually, they were visibly flustered, scanning the crowd as if expecting judgment. When they finally found us, their faces betrayed an awkward mixture of pride and shame, a silent acknowledgement of the consequences of their neglect. My children, ever aware of the dynamics, responded with calm confidence. Lila's eyes sparkled as she explained her latest art project to a group of adults, and Jaden answered questions about his science experiment with a poise that made my parents shrink in comparison. Grandpa Edward, ever the strategist, observed from the sidelines. He had taught my children that true victory did not need to be loud, and this event became a masterclass in that lesson. The subtle recognition my parents received from the community, juxtaposed with their own awkwardness, highlighted the power of consistent love versus selective affection. The silence of my parents, once their shield, had become their exposure. And Grandpa's satisfaction was quiet but immense, knowing that each step of this intricate plan was unfolding exactly as he had envisioned. As the weeks turned into months, the patterns intensified. Lila began receiving offers to display her art at regional galleries, invitations that my parents could not ignore. Jaden's soccer team was recognized at community events, and his achievements were celebrated online and in local media. Grandpa Edward ensured that these moments were documented, highlighted, and impossible to dismiss. My parents' attempts at acknowledgement were often awkward, belated, and entirely insufficient. The contrast between their neglect and Grandpa's nurturing became a spectacle in its own right, a public, undeniable reminder of what they had forfeited. Yet the most potent part of Grandpa's plan was not the visibility of my children's successes, but the emotional weight of their absence. My parents began to feel the sting of their decisions in private moments, the quiet evenings when they realized they had missed another milestone, the subtle embarrassment when distant relatives praised my children in conversation, the silent recognition that they had allowed time and opportunity to slip by while Grandpa had stepped in with unwavering love. Regret, once a distant concept, began to take root, not as a fleeting thought, but as a gnawing presence that colored their daily lives. It was during a family holiday that the culmination of these quiet maneuvers became undeniable. My children, radiant and accomplished, were the center of attention, not by demand but by nature. Friends, neighbors, and extended family could not help but notice the contrast between the children who had been nurtured and those who had been neglected. My parents, seated uncomfortably, could not hide their envy, nor the creeping awareness that their actions, or lack thereof, had consequences that were impossible to reverse. Grandpa Edward, sitting quietly across the room, simply observed, knowing that the storm he had quietly built was nearing its apex. The seeds of regret had been sown. The subtle, methodical orchestration of recognition, opportunity, and unwavering love had created a force that even my parents could not ignore. And as I watched my children laugh, play, and shine, I realized that the journey was far from over. Grandpa Edward had begun something that could not be undone, a reckoning that would force my parents to confront the weight of their neglect. And though they had yet to fully understand it, the consequences were inevitable, approaching like a tide they could no longer hold back. The story was no longer just about neglect. It had become about justice, about the power of love as both shield and weapon, and about the quiet authority of a grandparent who refused to allow betrayal to go unanswered. And as the sun set on that holiday, casting long shadows across the room, I knew that the next chapter would reveal the first true cracks in my parents' carefully maintained facade, a reckoning that would be impossible to avoid. The reckoning had begun, though my parents were still struggling to comprehend it. They moved through their days with a subtle unease, a gnawing sensation that something long ignored had suddenly taken form, and it was impossible to dismiss. Grandpa Edward had transformed quiet observation into a strategic campaign, and now the first visible consequences of their neglect began to take shape. It started with invitations that could not be avoided. Gala events, community recognition ceremonies, school board meetings, and local news features, all orchestrated to showcase Lila's art and Jaden's achievements in a way that left no room for denial. My parents, who had once navigated social circles with ease, now found themselves awkwardly confronted with evidence of the children they had ignored. Their absence, once invisible, now drew silent judgment and whispered criticism from others, leaving them vulnerable and exposed in ways they had never experienced. At first they tried to brush it off. They told themselves that they were busy, that obligations elsewhere prevented them from participating in these moments. But excuses became increasingly hollow, especially as my children's successes grew more public and undeniable. Lila's paintings were not just displayed in school halls. They were featured in community art exhibitions, highlighted in local newspapers, and shared across social media by admirers who recognized her talent. Jaden's soccer victories were no longer casual neighborhood wins. They became part of a narrative of excellence recognized by coaches, parents, and local sports reporters. Every event, every accolade was a reminder of the love and attention my parents had withheld. Grandpa Edward had engineered this reality with precision, understanding that true accountability was not about confrontation but about undeniable visibility. My parents could no longer ignore my children. They were unavoidable, celebrated, and thriving. And with each passing day, the quiet storm of regret that Grandpa had sown grew stronger, filling their lives with a tension they could not dissipate. Family gatherings became increasingly uncomfortable. My parents' attempts at acknowledgement were awkward, sometimes insincere, and never enough. They tried to offer compliments, but the warmth was missing, the sincerity hollow. My children, guided by Grandpa's wisdom, responded with polite smiles, their confidence intact, their self-worth undiminished. The power dynamic had shifted completely. My parents, once the unquestioned authority, now sat in the shadows of their own neglect, reminded at every turn that absence carried consequences. Grandpa Edward's strategy was subtle yet devastating. He did not humiliate them publicly, nor did he issue confrontations or lectures. Instead, he allowed their own actions, or lack thereof, to speak volumes. Invitations were extended in plain sight, accolades were displayed proudly, and my children's confidence became a mirror reflecting the choices my parents had made. The shame was internal, gnawing quietly at them, forcing a reckoning that words alone could never achieve. The breaking point came during a regional art showcase where Lila's work was the centerpiece. My parents had been invited months in advance, yet they arrived late, flustered, and clearly uncomfortable. The moment they entered the exhibition, they were confronted not just with the brilliance of Lila's paintings, but with the presence of friends, neighbors, and extended family who had witnessed years of absence finally collide with undeniable achievement. My children, radiant and self-assured, guided guests through the exhibit with pride, explaining each piece with a confidence my parents could neither challenge nor overshadow. It was in that moment that the subtle machinery of Grandpa's plan revealed its true power. My parents realized that their neglect had not diminished my children. It had merely delayed recognition that was now unstoppable. Every question from admirers, every compliment, every proud glance, highlighted their own failures in sharp relief. Grandpa Edward observed quietly, allowing them to confront the truth without interference, knowing that the realization itself would leave a deeper mark than any confrontation could. From that evening forward, the pattern became more pronounced. Invitations to community events, award ceremonies, and public showcases multiplied, all reinforcing the presence and achievements of my children. Lila's art began receiving regional and even national attention, her work praised for creativity, emotional depth, and technical skill. Jaden's accolades in sports expanded to broader leagues, where his skill, teamwork, and leadership were recognized and celebrated. Every triumph was a victory not just for the children, but for Grandpa Edward's careful orchestration of justice. My parents' attempts to reassert authority became increasingly futile. They tried to insert themselves into events, attempting to showcase pride that had long been absent. Yet the authenticity was missing, and the children, guided by Grandpa's unwavering support, responded with grace but no dependency. Lila and Jaden no longer sought approval. They had received it in abundance where it mattered most. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, leaving my parents exposed to the consequences of their neglect without any avenue for repair. Meanwhile, Grandpa Edward continued to teach my children lessons beyond mere recognition. He emphasized the value of integrity, resilience, and strategic patience. True power, he would say, is invisible until it becomes undeniable. Every accolade, every public recognition, every personal triumph was part of a larger lesson. Love, nurtured consistently and authentically, carries consequences that neglect cannot withstand. My parents were experiencing this firsthand, and the sense of helplessness was growing with every passing day. The subtle humiliation extended into private spaces as well. Conversations at home often drifted to school achievements, personal growth, and experiences my parents had overlooked. Grandpa ensured that my children spoke of these moments naturally, without bitterness, highlighting the contrast between the care they had received and the neglect they had endured. My parents found themselves confronted with truths that were impossible to ignore, moments that exposed the gap between what had been withheld and what had been nurtured. The pressure began to manifest physically and emotionally. My parents' interactions became strained, their conversations tinged with defensiveness and quiet guilt. Attempts to reclaim authority were met with polite resistance from my children, whose confidence and pride had been cultivated to withstand attempts at manipulation or belated approval. The environment they had created, once carefully controlled, now reflected their absence, and the reckoning orchestrated by Grandpa Edward could not be avoided. And yet, through it all, Grandpa maintained a calm presence, a quiet force guiding the course of events without a single word of confrontation. The strength of his strategy lay in its subtlety, in the fact that my parents' own actions, or lack thereof, were the instruments of their embarrassment and regret. Every missed milestone, every belated attempt at acknowledgement, every hesitation to fully embrace the achievements of my children became a thread in the tapestry of accountability that Grandpa Edward had woven with precision. The storm was no longer quiet. Its effects were visible in the tension that clung to every family gathering, in the nervous glances my parents exchanged when Lila or Jaden entered a room, in the subtle envy that shadowed even casual conversations. The reckoning had moved beyond internal reflection. It was now a tangible presence, an inevitable force, and one that my parents could neither control nor escape. And as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that the consequences of neglect could not be undone. Grandpa Edward had not only nurtured my children but had armed them with the tools to thrive independently of those who had failed them. Every success, every recognition, every moment of pride was both a victory for the children and a calculated measure of accountability for my parents. The scales were tipping and there was no returning to the comfort of ignorance. The story had reached a critical turning point. The reckoning was no longer impending, it had arrived. The next chapter would reveal how my parents began to confront their failures, the measures they took to regain control, and the realization that the quiet storm orchestrated by Grandpa Edward could not be silenced or undone. The reality of neglect had fully caught up to my parents. Every step they took was shadowed by the undeniable presence of my children, and every attempt to reclaim authority or recognition was met with resistance. Not defiance but quiet, unshakable confidence cultivated by Grandpa Edward. They were no longer the ones in control. The consequences of their indifference were no longer abstract, and the storm Grandpa had quietly orchestrated was no longer subtle. It was in full force. My parents had begun to realize that mere acknowledgement would not repair what they had broken. They attempted to intervene in my children's activities, sometimes offering help, sometimes attempting to impose rules or expectations, but the damage was already done. Lila and Jaden had been nurtured in an environment of love, consistency, and respect, and any attempt at control from my parents felt artificial and awkward. The children's responses, though polite, reflected their understanding that their worth did not depend on approval that had long been withheld. Grandpa Edward watched this unfold with a quiet, measured satisfaction. His plan had never relied on confrontation. It relied on cultivating undeniable proof of value where none had been recognized before. And now, as my parents tried to assert themselves, their presence felt intrusive and out of place. Invitations and achievements had made them spectators in a life they had once dismissed, a life now flourishing under Grandpa's guidance. The contrast between their absence and my children's presence could not have been more apparent. At a major community event celebrating young talent, the stage was set for the most visible confrontation of all. Lila's art had been selected for a feature exhibit, and Jaden had been invited to receive an award for his leadership on the soccer team. My parents had been informed weeks in advance, and unlike past events, they had made a visible effort to attend. Yet their presence did not erase the weight of years spent ignoring milestones, birthdays, recitals, or everyday moments that mattered most. Their attempts at pride seemed rehearsed, their smiles slightly forced, their glances constantly flicking toward Grandpa Edward and the children, searching for acknowledgement that was already theirs by right. The event became a stage not for humiliation, but for undeniable truth. Lila presented her artwork with poise, explaining her vision, her technique, and her inspiration with clarity and passion. Jaden accepted his award with humility and confidence, acknowledging the guidance of Grandpa Edward and the support of his peers. Every applause, every compliment, every recognition was amplified by the absence of parental validation. The community's acknowledgement highlighted what my parents had withheld for years, and they could feel it in the weight of the room, the quiet but unmistakable judgment that required no words. Attempts to insert themselves into these moments only emphasized the gap. My parents approached with carefully crafted phrases of encouragement, trying to make up for years of absence, but the authenticity was missing and both children responded with calm detachment. Lila politely nodded, thanked them, and returned to sharing her work. Jaden acknowledged them in passing but continued to focus on his peers and accomplishments. Grandpa Edward had prepared them well, not for confrontation, but for the inevitability that their achievements would be celebrated regardless of the approval of those who ignored them. At home, the tension became more pronounced. My parents tried to control the narrative, subtly attempting to assert influence over my children's schedules, their hobbies, and their accomplishments. Yet each move was countered by Grandpa's guidance and my children's growing self-assurance. They had learned to recognize genuine care versus obligation, and the difference was clear. Lila and Jaden responded not with defiance but with polite boundaries, honoring Grandpa's teachings while navigating the awkward attempts at control from my parents. The psychological weight of their failures began to manifest in small but significant ways. Conversations were clipped, interactions felt strained, and even casual remarks carried an undercurrent of unease. They could no longer ignore the truth. Neglect leaves a mark, and no belated attempt at redemption could erase what had already been lost. The subtle, strategic planning of Grandpa Edward had created a reality where absence had consequences, where love and guidance were visible and undeniable, and where the children's strength made their neglect impossible to hide. It was during a quiet evening after a particularly successful week of achievements that Grandpa Edward took a moment to reflect on the broader lesson his orchestration had created. He had taught my children more than resilience and confidence. He had shown them the power of strategy, of patience, and of turning injustice into undeniable proof of worth. My parents, by contrast, were learning their lesson in a way that no confrontation could have forced, through observation, through realization, and through the unstoppable presence of the children they had ignored. The tipping point came unexpectedly. At a casual family gathering, a distant relative asked my parents to speak about their grandchildren's achievements. Caught off guard, they attempted to respond with pride, but the words faltered. They realized painfully that their approval was no longer required, that my children's achievements spoke for themselves. Grandpa Edward had created a stage where recognition was earned through action, not permission, and my parents had been relegated to spectators. Their hesitation, their awkwardness, and their late attempts at acknowledgement only underscored the stark reality of neglect. From that point onward, their attempts at reconciliation grew desperate. They invited Lila and Jaden to exclusive events, tried to shower them with gifts, and even sought to manipulate social situations to reassert their influence. But Grandpa Edward had built a foundation so strong that these gestures, though well-intentioned, lacked impact. The children had learned to measure worth through consistent love and genuine support, and these belated attempts at control were transparent and ineffective. The lesson was clear. Actions, not words, determine legacy. The years of neglect had consequences that could not be undone by sudden appearances, lavish gifts, or fleeting praise. Grandpa Edward's strategy had transformed potential resentment into undeniable strength, creating a reality in which the children thrived independently of those who had failed them. My parents' attempts at redemption were ineffective because they had missed the fundamental principle that love requires consistency, presence, and authenticity. By the end of the chapter, it was evident that the final act of this story, the ultimate confrontation, the point where neglect meets accountability, was inevitable. Grandpa Edward had orchestrated every step with precision, ensuring that the reckoning would not be a spectacle of drama, but a quiet, undeniable truth. The children, confident and unshakable, embodied the lessons of resilience, strategy, and the power of consistent love. My parents, confronted with the reality of what they had ignored, could only observe, reflect, and slowly come to terms with the consequences they had set in motion. What followed would reveal the culmination of years of neglect, the full impact of Grandpa Edward's meticulous strategy, and the ultimate realization for my parents that their absence had left scars that could not be erased, but had also forged an unbreakable strength in my children. The day had arrived when the reckoning was no longer quiet. Grandpa Edward's patient orchestration of justice had reached its peak, and the final act of accountability would unfold in ways that were both subtle and undeniable. My parents, once confident in their ability to shape the family narrative, were now confronted with the cumulative weight of years spent ignoring the children they should have cherished. What had once been a minor sting, the quiet disappointment of birthdays missed and milestones unnoticed, had grown into a tidal wave of truth they could no longer escape. The occasion was a community gala honoring youth achievement, an event where Lila's art had been selected for the main exhibition and Jaden was to receive recognition for his leadership and athletic accomplishments. Invitations had been extended months in advance, every detail meticulously planned by Grandpa Edward to ensure maximum visibility. The children, radiant and confident, entered the hall with a calm assurance, knowing their worth was undeniable and independent of the approval of those who had neglected them. My parents arrived late as they had often done, but this time their lateness was not casual. It was weighted with anxiety, a sense of dread that something inescapable awaited them. The moment they walked in, they were surrounded by people who had witnessed years of their absence, all aware of the children's achievements. The contrast was striking. Lila and Jaden glowing in recognition, their parents flustered and awkward, trying to insert themselves into a narrative they had no longer authored. Grandpa Edward, standing quietly at the side, observed the scene with calm precision, knowing that the true power of this moment lay not in words, but in undeniable proof. Lila's artwork, displayed prominently at the entrance, drew admiration from everyone present. Guests asked questions, offered praise, and marveled at her talent and vision. Jaden's award ceremony followed, where his achievements were celebrated openly, his confidence and humility shining brightly. Every cheer, every applause, every acknowledgement from peers and community members was a reminder that love and guidance, when consistent and authentic, created consequences that could not be erased by absence. My parents attempted to interject, offering belated praise and awkward congratulations. But it was ineffective. Lila smiled politely, acknowledging their words without seeking their approval. Jaden, standing tall with his award, nodded in acknowledgement but immediately returned his attention to those who had supported him consistently. Grandpa Edward's strategy had ensured that their presence was neither necessary nor impactful. The children's achievements spoke for themselves. The realization hit my parents with undeniable clarity. Their years of neglect had consequences that could not be undone. Every missed recital, Every birthday forgotten, every quiet disappointment had accumulated into a ledger of accountability that now stood before them in living color. Their attempts at redemption, though visible, were hollow compared to the consistent love and guidance provided by Grandpa Edward. The children were thriving not because of them but in spite of them, and the contrast was both humbling and devastating. Throughout the evening, subtle reminders of their failures surrounded them. Conversations in which neighbors praised the children's talents, comments from relatives who had long recognized the difference in attention, and even small gestures from the community highlighted the years of absence and the children's triumphs. Each moment was a piece of undeniable truth. Neglect has consequences, and consistent love carries power that cannot be ignored. As the gala progressed, my parents' discomfort grew. They attempted to engage, to celebrate, to reassert a presence they had long ignored, but every effort emphasized the very gap they had created. Lila and Jaden's independence, confidence, and achievements were no longer dependent on validation. They had internalized the lessons of resilience, patience, and self-worth taught by Grandpa Edward. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. My children had become the center, and my parents, once authority figures, were now witnesses to the consequences of their choices. Grandpa Edward's influence extended beyond recognition and public acclaim. He had nurtured my children in a way that had transformed neglect into strength. Lila had learned that her worth was inherent, not contingent on the approval of those who failed her. Jaden understood that leadership and success required integrity, patience, and the courage to rise regardless of external validation. Every achievement, every accolade, every confident step was a reflection of this guidance, and a reminder that true power lies in consistent, authentic care. The final moment of reckoning occurred when the awards ceremony concluded, and the children's names were announced repeatedly, accompanied by applause and admiration from the audience. My parents, sitting together, could no longer ignore the reality. Their neglect had been documented in living, breathing proof. Every recognition, every cheer, every acknowledgement highlighted what they had missed. The realization was quiet but crushing. No words could erase the consequences. No gestures could fill the void left by years of absence. In the days that followed, my parents attempted reflection. They reached out in attempts at reconciliation, but Grandpa Edward had already prepared the children for this. Lila and Jaden responded with grace and dignity, acknowledging their parents' presence without dependence on approval. The lessons instilled by Grandpa ensured that they would not be controlled by guilt or manipulation. Instead, they embodied strength, resilience, and the undeniable truth that love, when consistent and authentic, has consequences that cannot be ignored. The final lesson was clear and indelible. My parents had learned that neglect leaves scars, and that belated attempts at recognition, while visible, cannot erase the years of absence. Grandpa Edward's patient orchestration had created justice not through confrontation, but through undeniable proof. The thriving, confident, and celebrated children who had grown under his guidance. Their achievements were not temporary, nor were they contingent on parental approval. They were the living embodiment of love's power, and the ultimate reckoning for those who failed to nurture it. By the end, my parents were left to reckon with their choices privately. The community, the family, and even their own social circles bore witness to the consequences, and the scale of accountability was complete. Grandpa Edward's strategy had worked flawlessly. The children thrived, the neglect was confronted indirectly but powerfully, and the lesson of love's consistency became undeniable. And so the story concluded not with dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, undeniable truth. Love, when wielded with patience, strategy, and unwavering authenticity, carries consequences that neglect cannot withstand. The children, nurtured and confident, were the ultimate testament to this principle. My parents, confronted with the reality of their choices, had no option but to acknowledge the justice of love. Grandpa Edward, the orchestrator of this reckoning, stood silently, knowing that the lesson had been taught, the balance restored, and the children's strength secured for life. In the end, the story was not one of revenge in its harshest sense. It was a story of justice, nurtured carefully and delivered flawlessly. It was a reminder that neglect has consequences, love carries power, and the strength of a grandparent's guidance can turn betrayal into undeniable triumph. The final chapter of this story closed with peace, resilience, and the quiet satisfaction of a lesson perfectly delivered.